Okay, hi, I'm Archie Law. I'm the chair of the Sydney Peace Foundation. And at the Sydney Peace Foundation, we're worried about the impact that climate action and climate change is having on access to peace and justice. We believe that a lasting peace means a just and fair transition to a safe climate for everyone. We're interviewing leading thinkers and change makers about the link between climate action, peace and justice in this series called A Climate of Peace. These are short sessions designed to give you an insight into ways that people can, should and are taking climate action. Today it's a great privilege to have the Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers MP with us to talk about climate action. So welcome to A Climate of Peace, Jim.
Oh, thanks very much for the opportunity, and congratulations to the Foundation for the work that you're doing in this area.
No, thanks very much, Jim. Really appreciate it. And just to kick off, you're obviously in a really important role as Australia's alternative treasurer. And before we get into a little bit around that, I'm just interested in your thoughts on the importance of protecting the environment and acting on climate change and how they're relevant to your values as a Labor Party politician. And, you know, for you as a human being, how are those concepts connected?
Yeah, well, I think that when it comes to the economy, I think strong and sustainable go hand in hand. You know, for a long time, we became accustomed to thinking that you had to choose between one or the other. I've had a passion for economic policy for a long time now, but I want that policy and I want our economy to be really sustainable. I want us to attach genuine value to our natural assets. You know, each of us, or many of us in our personal lives, draw real strength and sustenance from the natural world. And I think in lots of ways we should be drawing economic strength and sustenance from the natural world too. And that's recognising that a lot of our natural assets have community value, they have cultural value, but they also have genuine economic value. And, you know, when it comes to one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about, you know, cleaner and cheaper energy, for example, is because that's one of the ways that I think we can get emissions down, which is really important, but we also can get the right kind of investment into our economy. We can grab those jobs and opportunities and really seek and find those win-wins in the environmental world and the economic world simultaneously.
And given the situation we're in at the moment, Jim, with, you know, it's almost a bit of a perfect storm as far as the economic crisis, you know, the climate crisis and you know, the pandemic on top of it. Do you feel like we're potentially near some sort of tipping point where we might see a real change in these sort of areas?
I certainly think that the community has you know, contemplated with a bit more intensity than perhaps earlier years. You know, the role of climate when it comes to the bushfire season, the role of energy when it comes to creating new jobs and opportunities. I think there has been a focus, more of a focus on these opportunities and these you know, pressures on our society than perhaps before. But in lots of ways, you know, maybe that the political world isn't keeping up with some of that community sentiment. And it's our job to represent that, to reflect it, but also to show communities right around Australia that we can do something about cleaner and cheaper energy. We can do that without, you know, abandoning some of our traditional strengths. We can add some strings to our bow. And if we do that effectively, and we do that intelligently, then we can address some of these genuine concerns and fears that people have in the community. And you know, we can get our energy costs down and we can get our emissions down and we can get some of those win-wins.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim. And I mean, you sort of alluded to it in there, but I mean, earlier this year you talked about the decades-long Barney that's surrounded climate policy in Australia, and you know, congratulations on calling for it to end as well. How do you think that Barney can end, and you know, what are the Labor Party's plans to make that happen?
Well, the main thing we did, and it's something I'm, you know, personally proud of, is that Anthony Albanese wrote to the Prime Minister Scott Morrison and said, look, This can't go on like this. We've got a problem with business investment. We should have a mid-century target of net zero emissions. We should have a way to work together to try and get there. The economics have become so remarkably compelling. The business community, even some of the biggest companies who haven't traditionally been associated with action on climate change have said something needs to be done. So we should take this moment as an opportunity for the big parties in the parliament to work together. So Anthony wrote to Scott Morrison to suggest that. Inevitably, that will require some compromises. Inevitably, it will give parties of government the opportunity to either ramp up or ramp down their ambitions when it comes to emissions reduction. But that should be really a no-brainer for a country like ours, a first world, first-rate, intelligent country with an economy where the stakes are so high, particularly in this recession, but even probably more particularly in the recovery. We should be able to come together and agree some of the basic rules of the road. That would be a really important first step. One of the reasons why businesses aren't investing as much as we would like in energy assets, but also more broadly in the economy, is because they don't know if things are going to chop and change every 12 or 18 months. And so I think there's a role that we can play even from opposition in trying to give business that certainty.
And I'm interested too in the say business, recognising not a homogenous group as, in many ways, but do you feel there's a real pressure coming from the business community for action as well as that certainty around climate policy and economic settings?
Oh, absolutely. And it may be that the business community is the best chance that we have of shifting the coalition towards, coming together or coming up with, a responsible, effective plan here. So many of these companies, and you would know as well as anyone, so many of these companies have come forward and said, in our own company, we support net zero emissions by mid-century. We're open to a conversation about how we get there. Let's get the investment climate nice and certain so that we know what we're investing in, because so many of these energy assets have very long time frames. And so they've been terrific. Many businesses have been absolutely terrific in making this case. And so we need to build that momentum and build on that momentum.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I suppose also interested that maybe putting something to you, a little bit of crystal ball gazing almost, but say the Labor Party wins the next election, what sort of economic levers can you pull when you take government when it comes to something like climate? How do you see that unfolding?
Well, there's a couple of different things. I mean, first of all, that investment framework is probably the most important thing. We've discussed that a bit, so that would probably be, from my point of view, the highest priority. But there are other levers too. One of the things we should be really proud of is the way that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which was put in place under the last Labor government, that's done some remarkable work in the co-investment area. And co-investment's absolutely crucial. There's been a lot of good partnerships struck. There's been a lot of good projects built. It's actually made money for the Commonwealth, which we suspected it would, and delighted that it has. So there are areas of potential in co-investment. That's something that I believe in. There may be other areas that we can engage that sort of co-investment strategy. But, in doing that, we do leverage and encourage more and more cleaner and cheaper energy assets, and that's a terrific thing. So those are at least two levers that we should be contemplating.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim. I'm also interested in your thoughts about the links between climate action and a peace and just society, and how those two things come together, and what the consequences are for society of not acting on climate change.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of justice, it's often the most vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable countries, especially in our region, who are most impacted by climate change. And so there is, I think, a social justice element here, which is very important. But also, I mean, the economic consequences of getting this wrong. Less usable land, rising sea levels, a whole range of consequences which would be quite damaging to the economy as well. My view is that economic mobility and social justice aren't two contradictory things, that they go hand in hand. That the more inclusive an economy is, the more sustainable an economy is, the stronger that economy is. And climate change is obviously a key part of that.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And we're asking this question to everyone that we're interviewing, but if there's one single thing that you could do to create a safe climate for everyone, what would that be?
Oh, look, I think I've got a role to play in trying to end that climate change war, that energy war of the last decade or so. I'm very fortunate in having colleagues like Anthony Albanese and Mark Butler and others who understand how important this is and want to actually take genuine action. And so if we were given the privilege of governing after the next election, then I think the best thing I can do for anyone who believes in getting our energy cleaner and cheaper and bringing down emissions, the best thing I can do is to try and settle that investment framework, to get engaged in the co-investment, and to be a part of a government that genuinely believes in tackling climate change.
Terrific. Look, thanks so much for your time today, Jim. I know it's a really busy schedule, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. And for everyone who's taking the time to watch this, you can obviously follow the work of the Sydney Peace Foundation and also the Sydney Peace Prize on all of our social media pages and online. So thanks again, Jim.
No, thanks for the opportunity. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.